Today's story was written by Reddit user Lucas AK2004. What is the most effective learning method? When my high school science teacher asked that question, I didn't really think of it at the time. It was my senior year and I was just trying to skate through to graduation. The answers that came from the class were what you'd expect: visual, verbal, reading, etc. However, no one could get the correct answer. That's when I thought for a moment and came up with one that no one else had said yet, so I raised my hand. The hard way, the most effective way of learning is the hard way, I said confidently. I had surely got it. No, that's not it. Well, at least I tried. Apparently, whatever suits the individual best was the correct answer. I stopped paying attention to class after that. Thinking back on it now, I guess I was sort of right, at least for me. With no other method, I have learned better. I was told not to join the military right out of high school, over and over. But I still did, and found out why the hard way. I read why you shouldn't mess with rattlesnakes. I didn't learn until I messed with one and found out, you guessed it, the hard way. That's just how things were for me. The hard way was the only way I knew. Colour me surprised when I found out aliens were real by getting abducted. Oh yeah, maybe I should have mentioned that part first? Oh well, I guess I'll start from the beginning. It was January 2nd, it was my last day on leave, and I had already said my goodbyes to my family. There was still a few hours before my bus left, so I decided to take a nature walk through the nearby woods. I walked for maybe a mile or two when it started to get pretty dark, so I decided to turn around and head back. It was maybe a few minutes after I turned around when there was a sharp pain in my neck. I ran my hand over the spot that had been afflicted and I saw a small bit of blood. I honestly didn't think much about it. Maybe I got stabbed by a tree branch or something. Then I started to feel a bit drowsy. Soon I began to stumble and was barely able to walk. The last thing I remember before passing out was falling into a snowbank and hearing a loud rush of wind. Bright lights were the first thing I saw when I came to. I felt groggy and slightly hungover. After a few moments of pain and my eyes adjusting, I could see that I was in a room. The room was pretty bare, white walls, a single table that I was lying on in the centre of the room, and a door. When I tried to get up, my legs quickly buckled, nearly sending me to the floor. It took me a minute or two of shaking them out before I was able to stand on my own. I walked around the room and confirmed that there really was nothing of interest. Now, being abducted by aliens wasn't my first thought as to what had happened to me, though being kidnapped was high on my list of theories. I say that's close enough to being right. I did have everything on me that I had when I was knocked out, minus my backpack, so maybe it was safe to assume I wasn't kidnapped. Or they were some of the dumbest kidnappers ever and had too much faith in whatever drugs they gave me. My train of thought was interrupted when I heard footsteps coming from the other side of the door. Well, either way, I wasn't going to risk it until I was sure, so I pulled out my pocket knife and pressed myself against the wall next to the door. A few moments passed before the door clicked and slid open. Well, alien abduction shot straight to the top of my list of theories of what was going on, when an insect-like thing walked into the room. When I say insect-like, I mean it looked as though it had an exoskeleton, claws, mandibles, and antennae, though the eyes were more akin to solid white marbles. Before it realised that I was awake and not lying on the table, I wrapped my arm around its neck and brought my knife up to its face. That certainly surprised it. It grabbed my arm that was around its neck and struggled a bit before realising the effort was fruitless. Thankfully, I noticed it had a pistol before it got a chance to reach it. I took it from its holster and quickly stuffed it into my waistband. Easy now, I just want to figure out what's going on, not trying to hurt you. The alien clicked loudly. It was clear that whatever it said wasn't directed towards me, as I heard a couple sets of heavy footsteps coming from the open door. While keeping my hostage in front of me, I turned to look into the door. There was a hallway, and at the end, two of the same insect-like species holding rifles turned the corner. Apparently, either my hostage wasn't important enough, or I was just that much of a threat, because soon after, the armed aliens opened fire and turned my hostage into a meat shield. It was a good meat shield too, stopping all the bullets that would have gone into me. Now, I was hiding behind cover, pinned down by alien fire, and presumably on an alien ship. How did things get turned upside down so quickly? I swore that I'd never go on a nature walk again. Hopefully I would get out of this alive so I could make that choice. While I thought about how to stay alive longer than a few minutes, I remembered that I still had that pistol. I pulled it out of my waistband and looked it over to see if I could figure out how to shoot the thing. It seemed fairly simple. It didn't appear to have a hammer, and the trigger was relatively in the correct place, if a little big. However, when I pointed it around the corner and attempted to fire, nothing happened. I inspected the gun once again for some kind of safety. While sliding my hands all over it, my finger found a small button on the back of the receiver. Pressing it made parts of the gun light up, and it made faint electronic sounds. Hell yeah, now we're in business. I then repeated my attempt to shoot my attackers, which also yielded no results. Unfortunately, this time I was too sloppy when I peeked around the corner, which resulted in me taking a shot to the ear. That really fucking hurt. I yelped in pain and grabbed my wound, which only made it hurt even more. Things were really looking bleak now, with my blood trickling down the side of my face and staining my fingers. It made me stop to think for a moment. Blood. I looked at the gun that I had dropped into the first alien's blood that was now pooling on the floor. It seemed a bit far-fetched, but I really didn't have any better ideas. I stuck my hand in the orange blood and made sure to coat it well before picking up the gun once again. This time I test-fired into the dead body. Upon pulling the trigger, a shot rang out and pierced the dead alien's head. Of course. It would make sense that they would have some kind of biolock on their guns. After all, you wouldn't want some monkey going and stealing one, I said to myself. I actually felt kinda smart for a moment. I waited for one or both of the aliens to reload before peeking once again, and returning fire. Turns out I'm a pretty good shot because I domed one of them with my first shot. I wasn't as lucky with the other one, as he soon retreated deeper into the ship after I sent a few shots his way. Finally, I felt that I was starting to get control over my current situation, but there was still work to do, like clearing out the rest of the presumed ship. I slowly walked to the one I had killed and picked up his rifle as well as a few magazines. The bullets didn't seem to have any propellant charge on them. Perhaps the propulsion comes from inside the gun, I guessed. Thankfully, the blood trick worked with the rifle too, and now I was considerably better armed and ready for some close quarters battle. I thought back to my training and cursed the fact that because I wasn't infantry, I was never trained on how to clear rooms, and all that I can remember from talking with one of my buddies is that it involved a lot of grenades. Since I didn't have either of those things, I figured I was going to have to pioneer this shit. I just hoped that I could avoid getting shot more than I had to. Fortunately, I must have grazed a second alien because there was a small trail of blood drops leading me through the hallway. I followed the trail about 100 feet until it stopped in the middle of a passage, right where there was a crossway. The blood trail stopped, like the wound was sealed right on the spot. I figured that the alien had gone behind one of the corners and was waiting for me to walk into an ambush of sorts. I stayed against the left wall and looked as far as I could down the right hallway, which quickly ended at a door, leaving little to no room for someone to be hiding behind the corner. That left hallway going left, I stuck my rifle around the corner and fired wildly until I heard a yell and something hitting the ground. Then I shot a few more times, just to be sure. I waited and listened, just to make sure that there were no others behind the corner to light me up as soon as I peeked. There was coarse and shaky breathing as well as a few alien clicks, but it didn't sound like there were any others. I carefully and slowly turned the corner with my rifle, pointed forwards just in case. On the floor was a second armed alien. He was hit several times and was dragging himself away towards another intersection down the hallway. I approached to secure his dropped weapon, but as soon as I knelt down to pick it up, he pulled out a pistol and shot at me, scoring a hit on my left arm. I quickly brought up my gun and emptied the rest of the magazine into him before whatever adrenaline I had wore off and the pain hit me. Fuck, holy shit, oh my god, that hurt so fucking bad. A steady flow of dark blood flowed out of the wound, and I quickly searched for something to stop the bleeding. I had no bandages and nothing to try and pack it with, so I figured my best bet was to tourniquet it. I grabbed my belt and wrapped it around my arm. Then I pulled as tightly as I could, all the while wincing in pain. It still bled considerably, but it was enough to buy me time until I could find a better solution, or a better tourniquet. After that, I took note of the time on my watch and decided to press forward. As I passed by the alien, I gave him a good kick just to be sure he wasn't going to get up and shoot me in the back or something. The other intersection seemed to be a mirror of the previous intersection. They both led to a few doors. I looked to the one that I had assumed to be going towards the front of the ship and approached it. The door had no handles or anything that looked like it could be used to physically open the door. However, there was a panel to the right of it, about halfway up. I pressed firmly on the panel and the door slid open. On the other side stood another of the bug aliens. I really needed to come up with a name for these things, especially if I was going to be running into them often. I decided a fitting name would be Roaches, because of their appearance and less than friendly attitude. This roach was standing in some kind of control room. Most importantly, it was focused on a panel of sorts, allowing me to get the jump on him. I didn't want to take any chances, considering how the others reacted to me, so I decided it was best to take him out while I had the chance. Painfully, I lifted my rifle into my shoulder and took aim. The recoil was more than I thought my arm could take. I tried my best to fire somewhat accurately, but the pain made the task nigh impossible. Shots hit randomly, sparks spewed from destroyed electronics, and alarms blared. After my assault had ceased, the roach was no longer standing. Instead, he was lying on the floor halfway behind a console. I slowly approached it with my gun at the ready. In my flurry of fire, I had scored a couple hits, and now he lay dead. I was about to make a comment about how he should have had better spatial awareness when I was tackled from the rear. On my way down to the floor, my head struck something, only adding to the shock. I took punches and tried to reply with some of my own, but needless to say, they were less than effective. Eventually, our scuffle turned into me on my back with my opponent on full mount. It wasn't going great for me, but when he pulled out something long, shiny, and most definitely sharp, I began to genuinely start to fear for my life. It went to plunge the knife into me, only stopped last minute by me grabbing into it. I knew a way to get out of this, but I was going to have to take a stab for it to work. But if it did, I was going to inflict a lot more pain on my opponent. I already figured I wasn't going to make it out alive, so I gritted my teeth and let go, letting the knife plunge into my stomach. Without hesitation, I grabbed his hips and thrust it up with mine, taking him off balance. His hands came off the knife and landed on either side of my head in perfect position for me to hook my good arm around his. Finally, on the same side, I hooked my leg around his and sent a punch as hard as I could into his side. He rolled off me, but I was sure to keep hold of his arm. The roach screeched in pain as I came to a crouch and rotated his arm, breaking his shoulder. He was done fighting for sure, but unluckily for him, I wasn't. I yanked the knife out of my stomach and plunged it into his chest several times until he too faded away. I backed away and rested my back on one of the consoles. Since I had woken up, I hadn't really had all that much time to think about what had happened. The last 30 minutes or so replayed in my mind a couple of times, and realization finally hit. I had just massacred an entire ship. Sure, the first few had it coming, but the last two? One didn't even get a chance, and the other was probably just scared that I would do the same to him. However, priorities came first. I decided it was best to not think about it for the moment. I was still slowly bleeding out after all. I carefully pulled myself to my feet and began looking around for anything that could help me. I searched through any drawer, cabinet, or box I could find, but nothing seemed helpful. Even if it was, I probably couldn't tell as it was all alien. Soon, my mind began slipping. The blood loss was becoming too great. Still, I pushed myself to keep going, to find something, anything that might save me. I began desperately walking through the ship, going room to room, hoping there was some kind of medical bay. After nearly half an hour of wandering, I finally found a room that I could recognize, just from the freezing temperature. Lined up on each side of the walls were a number of what I could only assume were cryopods. I moved to the closest one, stumbling onto it as I got close. My mind could just barely process that this one was already occupied. I wasn't really in a position to care who occupied it, so I just moved to the one right next to it, which was empty. I fumbled around the pod a bit, trying to find some way to open it until I finally pressed something that seemed to wake it up. The pod lit up and made all kinds of strange noises before opening with a hiss. I pulled myself into the pod, using most of whatever energy I had left. Everywhere my bare skin touched burned from the sheer cold, but at this point I hardly cared. As soon as I was settled into the pod, it closed, locking me inside. Then a freezing fog filled the chamber, and after a few moments, everything went black. Death felt close. Whatever happened next was no longer in my hands.